senior people from the industry. We have Russell and Stan. Stanley is basically a member of AES India. We also have Kushro, a very senior member of our fraternity. Hi, Kushro. I'll just ask everyone to unmute at the moment.
Hi.
Hi, Kushro. We also have Mr. Ram and Mr. Anirban. They are basically, Brent, I told you about this company yesterday, Pulse, and I had sent you the link, right? So Mr. Ram and Mr. Anirban are basically from Pulse, India.
Hi, Karthik. Good evening.
Stanley.
Hi.
We also have a lot of common names, a lot of industry friends who have joined in. Nice to see. The participant list is slowly increasing. Okay, I think we have reached the time to start. Brent, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, great. Your video was switched off for a while, so I was wondering whether. I'll right now I'll mute everyone except Brent and myself. Brent, just for your information, Roshan, who was supposed to be co-hosting with me, he's slightly stuck up at a particular. He's got some place where he's stuck up. He should be joining in probably the next 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully.
Okay.
So I'll add him when he comes. So yeah, so we can start the session. We have, oh, wonderful to see KJ Singh also join in. Hi, KJ.
Hi, Raman. Karthik, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
Not too bad.
Wonderful to see you. So, Brent, just for your information, KJ Singh is a very famous like person in the audio fraternity in India. He's a recording engineer, mastering engineer, among many other things. He wears many hats, and he's a very senior and respected gentleman in the industry. Thank you for joining, KJ. So you have some very august audience in the. Hi, KJ.
Hi. Hi, Brent.
I'm going to mute everyone right now, and we'll start off. We are at 8:36 India time, and it's 7:06 Seattle time where Brent is located. So I'm going to ask everyone to unmute. I'm going to ask everyone to mute. Rather, I've muted everyone, and I'm going to just unmute Brent. Okay. So Brent, are you online? I'm not able to see your video. Yeah, okay, great. So you're there. Okay, so welcome all to session 6 of what is known as the Masterclass in audio sessions. We had a break of almost, I think, about a couple of years before we had this session 6 start off. So we had 5 sessions wherein we started the Masterclass in audio sessions with Brent itself. Session 1 was Brent talking about various topics, and after that we had Cohen Weissen, we had Joachim Gerhard, we had I think we had Peter Kottrup from Audio Note. So we had 5 sessions during the COVID times, and now we are back with session 6, and I have re-invited Brent to talk about several topics. So we have basically classified the overall discussion into 2 broad topics, which is basically recorded versus reproduced music, and the second being Dolby Atmos and its proliferation across the industry. So Brent, Brent is basically, he's a very renowned audio reviewer. And I am sure a lot of you know Brent from the audio industry. Like he's based in the US. He has been a marketing director of Dolby around the turn of the century. And he has also written for many, many audio magazines. And he's a very reputed and very well-known name in the industry. So over to you, Brent. I am just going to basically give you an outline of what the first session is all about. So we are going to be talking about recorded versus reproduced music or audio. So we're going to be covering basically the origins of studio recording, types of recording studios, and the intent of the recording studios. Then we'll talk a bit about recording to music versus movies. Then maybe a small discussion about analog and digital recording, and origins of high fidelity audio, and what is the intent of high fidelity or a hi-fi as it's popularly known. And a very interesting discussion about whether high-end audio as it's known, whether it's actually hi-fi or whether it's something else. So high-end, whether it's hi-fi. And then we'll end this session with a discussion on equipment used for audio recording and the standards and any standards which exist. Then we'll have a small, like a 5-minute session which is open to all for Q&A with Brent, followed by the second topic, which is Dolby Atmos. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you.
Yeah, please go.
Oh, what should I?
Yeah, so you can basically talk about maybe the origins of studio recording and let's say recording for music versus movies and
Sure.
Topics like that.
I'll be frank with you. I don't know. I don't know the origins all that well until I came into it, which is about 1980 or something like that. I mean, I have some inkling of how. I mean, I'm a big jazz fan, so I have some inkling of how the early, jazz recordings were made. But I think that my real sort of expertise comes when I first started doing studio recordings, well, any recordings, which was sometime around 1981, I think, something like that. Playing in rock bands around the Dallas area, and studios were really primitive back then and really expensive, and because you had to record on analog tape, and all the machines were I think the first studio I really spent a lot of time in had I think it was a Tascam, maybe it was an Otari 8-track reel-to-reel, and those were fantastic machines, but they were $5,000–6,000, and of course, and then you needed a mixing board, you needed outboard effects, you had to spend a minimum of probably something like $15,000 to put together any kind of studio at all. And whereas of course now artists, people like Billie Eilish just record in their house with a laptop and a USB interface and whatever microphone, so it's incredibly cheap. The USB interface costs you $200 or something. The microphones now are really, I mean, microphones, weirdly, a Shure SM57 costs the same now as it did when I was in college, which was 40 years ago. I remember paying like almost $100 for an SM57 back then, and I pay $100 for one now. And then of course there are all sorts of cheap microphones that are available. So the recording industry in terms of music has just changed radically, going from this super specialized, super expensive thing to something that literally just about anybody can afford to do. And people even do stuff on their phones. I have a friend who's done a couple of commercials and just as a voice talent, and just talked into the phone to get the recording. It's funny. So it's changed a lot. I think the movie industry in terms of audio recording has changed a lot less. Of course, it's in the same way with home music recording. Now you can make a movie on a phone, really, on anything, and it's pretty good. But to do any kind of, you can do a fully professional music recording at home for essentially nothing, whereas doing a fully professional movie at home it could be done, but it's not going to be easy. That's still basically done in dubbing stages and in professional facilities. Karthik, I think you're muted.
Yeah. So thanks for the informing me. So we generally have a perception in the industry that the recording studios have very, very high quality equipment, and that's the result probably why even the reproduction side of the industry, as in the playback industry, also feels that the equipment is going to be great. Even on the playback side, on the reproduced side. Like, any insights on that? Because at the end of the day, I think that the recording industry is going to be, it's very challenged in terms of the budgets in trying to make the entire studios. In fact, a lot of studios have come up lately wherein budgets are very, very tight. So how does it work in terms of, let's say, the recording side versus the reproduced side, in terms of the equipment and the pricing and all those aspects, the techno-commercials, I would say?
Well, there are, very high-end components and audio products that can go into a studio. However, I would say that by and large, most of the stuff that's in a studio is somewhat generic, and so much of what's done in the studio nowadays is done quote unquote in the box, which means it's everything's done in the computer, and it's all done with digital plugins. There's still a lot of outboard gear that's analog, and some of that's very expensive. If you go buy a like a sort of a copy of a vintage compressor, like an LA2A compressor, which is sort of an old standard, you can find those for about, those would typically be something like $2,000 to $4,000 depending on who you get, but they make them for as little as about probably $600 now. But still, it's not that expensive relative to a lot of audiophile gear. And the vast majority of what's done out there is done with relatively cheap USB interfaces, which are perfectly good products. From companies like Focusrite that have signal to noise ratios that are comparable to almost anything out there, that have that are just dead flat out to 50 kilohertz or something. And they're really well engineered products. They sound great. They work great. And that the Focusrite interface I use is about $200. And we've done a lot of blind testing of these products for Wirecutter. Where we do recordings through multiple interfaces at once and see if people can hear the difference. And they can't hear the difference. I mean, you might hear a tiny little difference, but it's basically impossible to go, oh, this one's the Focusrite and this one is the Roland, or this one is the M Audio, or whatever. But then if you compare those digital to analog converters to super high-end digital analog converters in blind test, you probably can't tell the difference between those either. So on the pro side, there is, let's go back actually. On the analog side, there's a big, these products aren't just music reproducers, they're also status symbols. So you want to buy, if you're an audiophile, even if a $100, $200 DAC is perfectly functional, you probably want something fancier. On the pro side, that happens too, but a lot less often. And a lot of pro people will like to have a couple of something like an LA2A compressor, or some fancy analog gear that looks impressive, and some monitors that look really impressive. And maybe a big, Rupert Neve board or something like that. But in the end, all you really need is some Focusrite interfaces in a computer. And I don't mean to harp on Focusrite. There's lots of good USB interfaces out there, like UA makes a good one. But it's just a whole lot. You're right. It's focused a lot more on functionality, and at the end of the day, in high-end audio, you're looking. The more money you spend, the more you're starting to look for prestige rather than necessarily performance. Whereas in pro audio, if you're spending money, you're probably, if you have $10,000, $20,000 to spend, you're probably going to expand your capabilities. You're going to buy some new plugins that'll let you do some different effects. You're going to maybe Maybe you're going to put in Dolby Atmos capability. A lot of people are doing that now. Maybe you're going to go buy a couple of new microphones for slightly different sounds that you don't have now. Maybe you'll invest in some renovations to the space. It's
treatment,
not so
acoustic treatment, maybe.
Yeah, it's not so much about, because so many of the clients, when they go into a studio, don't really know all the gear that well. So it's not about the gear as much. So if you have, if you're, big name producer, big name mastering engineer, etc., I don't think people care as much about the gear that you have. Maybe in your ad in Tape Op magazine, which we have here in the US, maybe you list all the gear that you have if you're a mastering engineer and all that, but so much of mastering now is just done in the box on a computer with, isotope software or something like that anybody can afford. You're paying for the mastering engineer's expertise in that case, not really for the equipment.
Right. Anything about the standards that are there in the industry? Like, are there any recording standards which are used across the industry? Because I find that there's a lot of difference of opinion in which the way the stuff is supposed to be done in terms of, let's say, also why aren't they probably clear-cut standards to follow for things like in terms of equipment? Or I'll put the question in slightly a different way. Given a particular budget that maybe is available for spending on a studio, or let's say a recording setup, and a budget allocation maybe for a home theater or some space which is going to reproduce the music, how would you maybe allocate the budget in these two different spaces, on the reproduction side and on the recording side? It's a follow-up. It's a follow-up to what we already discussed just now. But in terms of absolute, are there some kind of guidelines that we could have?
That's a good question. I've never heard that question before. So
okay.
On the home side, on the home side, we typically say, people that are familiar with the science and blind testing, things like that, will tell you to invest more of your money in speakers, and you can set a some kind of a limit on it. You can set some percentages on it. You could say, a lot of times people say spend half your budget on speakers, and I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But I've got readers who are spending $600 on US on Triangle Borea BR03 speakers, which are fantastic speakers for $600, and they're hooking up to little cheap amps that you buy for like $100 on Amazon, and that's fine. That works. I've done it. So I hate to assign percentages, but in the home environment, what really, really matters is the speakers by far. There's no question about it. You can tell, anybody can tell speakers apart in a blind test. Nobody can tell anything else apart in the blind test. Well, maybe turntables, but not amps, not cables, not preamps, not DACs. So the speakers are really what matters. Whereas
I'm just going. I'm quite sure. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm quite sure that you're going to be having some very interesting questions from the audience on this topic, because there are a lot of people on the high-end side who particularly have this perception that every aspect of the chain makes a difference, like including cables, including amps, and so I'm sure you're going to get some very interesting questions in the interval. So be prepared. Yeah,
I get that all the time.
Yeah.
So on the pro side, the speakers kind of don't matter. There are so many great recordings that have been done with horrible monitor speakers, like Oratones, which are little things about that big that just have one driver, and they're kind of almost made to sound bad, because they're supposed to kind of replicate a really bad home system or a boombox or who knows what. And then so many recordings have been made with Yamaha NS10M speakers, which are kind of unpleasant to listen to. And it's in that case really a good. I mean, you have a mastering and recording engineer on here, but who could speak with more authority than me. But you know, mixing and mastering engineers, whether it be on the movie side or the music side, if they have monitors that they're used to, it doesn't matter. The monitors could even be headphones, maybe. It's whatever they're used to and their skills that matter. Whereas the gear that you're using to capture the recording and to mix the recording and all that is really what matters to the sound quality. The speakers really don't matter, because with the speakers, you're just listening to what the product is, okay? Whereas in home audio, the speakers really kind of are the product. So you want to probably invest, a lot of people invest a lot of money in microphones, which is a really good investment. You know, if I had, I mean, I got a lot of microphones. I keep wanting more, and I could use more. And I never get rid of my microphones. I always keep them, unlike a lot of audio gear. And you know, you can invest in plugins, and some, you know, you can get really cheap plugins for $30 or something like that. But to get some of the really good plugins, it might cost you $500 or $1,000. And you know, and you might want to invest in a really good, depending on the way your studio's set up. If you're fully in the box, then you don't really have like a mixing board. But if you have a combination computer and mixing board, if you're recording, say, a lot of instruments at once, you have a mixing board then. And you want to invest in a good mixing board, because the mixing board, if you run it flat, just as a preamp, it may make a difference in the sound, it may not. But I'd say in that case, any mixing board will give you good sound. But the EQs on those mixing boards are very different, and it's a matter of having an EQ that you're used to, and that recording engineers and mastering engineers develop a repertoire, just like a saxophone player would, right? A saxophone player learns a bunch of licks and can deploy those licks. If he's got a blues tune in B flat, he's got B flat blues licks ready to go. Whereas a recording or mastering engineer can go like, oh, here's this vocalist, and this vocalist is female, and she's got kind of a contralto voice, and so I've worked with singers like that before, and I'm going to use this microphone on her, and all that, and these EQ settings, and they have a rough idea of where to go if they have the mixing board that they're used to. And you know, I use a plugin for a Neve. Oh, I can't remember. I think it's an 1178 preamp that emulates that digitally and has the same controls. It even has kind of like an aged looking interface, like it's kind of beat up. And I know that, you know, that's a preamp and EQ that a lot of pros have used for decades. And I've gotten used to that, and it's just three, you know, it's bass, mid-range, and treble, and the treble's fixed and the bass and the mids are sweepable. You can change the frequency, and then there's a high-pass filter on it. And I've gotten used to grabbing that EQ in my plug-in and just running those knobs and being able to fix my sound. So it's so much a matter of what the engineer is used to, and what they know how to work, and what's within their repertoire. And if you throw an engineer who's used to a Neve board or something, or an SSL, and you throw them onto a board they're unfamiliar with, they are probably not going to give you as good of a product as they would if they're on a board that they're used to. I'm kind of rambling. I love to talk about this stuff, but in the home environment, to me, it's so much more simple, especially nowadays that we have good signage. You know, 30 years ago, we didn't. But now you can go buy a good set of speakers, and there's just lots of good sets of speakers out there at all price ranges. And you can set those up. And if you do a reasonable job of setup and your room is not too crazy, you're going to get good sound, pretty much no matter what components you plug in other than the speakers.
In this discussion, we're completely probably not, I wouldn't say chosen to ignore, but we have not talked too much about the effect of the room. So would you like to throw some insights on the effect of the room or the space that we're talking about in both on the recording side as well as the reproduction side, in the listening room setup for a residence, or let's say a home theater setup for a residence?
Sure. I'd like to talk about the recording side, because that's to me a lot tougher. And for someone like me who's, I mean, I have recorded a couple of albums. I'm working on another one, but I'm not a professional. I'm a, dabbler.
You're a modest guy.
I mean, compared to people that do this for a living, come on. And so this is the toughest part for recording for me personally, is since I record, if you're Billie Eilish, well, the only acoustic thing on the album is probably her voice. And that's not hard to do, because you can go buy one of these, foam wraparound things that kind of, and you put the mic in the middle, and I've got a couple of those, and it kind of kills most of the room sound, and you can sing into that, and it's almost like having a vocal booth, and it sounds really good. And since all the other instruments are electronically generated within the computer, then, or I should say digitally generated within the computer, the space doesn't matter. Whereas once you start to record real instruments, the space starts to matter, and that's where it gets potentially expensive, because if you play trumpet, let's say, or saxophone, those instruments might sound good in a vocal booth kind of setting where everything's super dead, but they might sound a lot better in a real room. But the real room needs to be big, and it needs to be set up with a controlled amount of reverberance to where it sounds good. It has the sound that you like. If you do it in a living room, it might not sound too good. If you do it in my kitchen, which I'm sitting in right now, which has no absorptive stuff other than what I'm sitting on right now, it's going to sound horrible. It's going to sound like a bad conference room or something. So the space is super, super critical, or it can be super. It can be totally unnecessary on the pro side, but more often than that, the space is really kind of important. And you can, I'm doing recordings now. I play double bass, stand-up bass, and to record that well, you need to back the microphone off probably 4 feet or something, in which case you're going to pick up a little bit of room tone. And my space I record in now has just foam all over the place, and it's as dead as I can make it. But if I wanted to do a good saxophone recording, it would be hard, or especially a drum recording, because with drums you can't get away from the fact that you need some kind of a reverberant environment to do them. And if you completely deaden the room, drums sound terrible. Right. So especially cymbals, it just kills everything. But in the home environment, I think the room it's funny. There's, in my opinion, the industry both ignores the room. When I say the industry, I mean audiophiles as well as the manufacturers, tends to ignore the room, except when they pay attention to the room, it's there's not as much rigor as you would like sometimes. So on one level, the room, given a well-designed speaker, something with a let's just say it's a 3-way, and let's say it's got an 8-inch woofer and a 3-inch mid-range and a 1-inch tweeter, and the crossover is well designed, and the speaker cabinet is reasonably well designed, that speaker is going to perform beautifully in almost any room. Okay, it's as long as if you have a 12-foot by 12-foot room, you're going to get a big giant upper bass hump in it, because you're going to have the resonance of the two 12-foot dimensions. Right. Or if you have a super if you have one of these sort of high-end homes with a lot of like the glass floor to ceiling windows and the wood floors or whatever floors, and there's no absorptive surfaces in it, that's going to sound not great. You know, vocals in particular tend to sound pretty bad in a room like that. Things get pretty sort of shouty and they start to sound more like this. But if you've got any kind of normal residential living room, and I'm speaking from the standpoint of the US, which I know well because I've lived here my whole life. You know, in any normal like US home or even apartment is probably, you know, with the normal furnishings, maybe a couch and maybe some drapes and things like that, it's going to sound halfway decent. It's going to have some absorption, it's going to have some reflection, so it'll have some sense of ambience to the room, and it'll also control it to some extent. And that's going to sound with a well-designed normal set of speakers will sound fine. Once you get into more you know, speakers that are designed outside the norm, it gets to be more complicated. But you know, there's a really great, you guys are familiar with Floyd Toole's book Sound Reproduction, right?
Yes, yes, we are.
Okay, so I mean, that book is about that thick, and the only person that can keep the entire contents of that book in his head is Floyd Toole, in my experience, because he can actually tell you like what's on what page, which is incredible. I can't tell you what I wrote. I literally cannot remember what I wrote last month, but anyway, so he has some fantastic acoustical prescriptions in that book, which are, you know, so many acoustical prescriptions that people say, like, you know, put this, you know, put these kind of absorbers in, put these kind of diffusers in, whatever, are based on measurements, purely on measurements, or based on sort of various suppositions about physics. Whereas Floyd's are based on actual listening tests, blind listening tests they did with acoustic treatment, which is, you know, not easy to do. And, you know, the prescription that he has is pretty simple. He says, look, on your wall behind your speakers, you know, you need to have some absorption, and you want to use, you know, foam that's at least 4 inches thick, okay? Because the thicker the foam, the lower the frequencies it'll absorb. And if you use like that, you know, that 2-inch wedge foam you can get for studios, that stuff's really cheap. It's all over the place, but it's terrible for treatment because it may be useful for certain things. It's good for killing flutter echo and stuff, but as your main absorptive treatment in a home theater room, it's terrible because it doesn't absorb down into the human vocal range. And so you kill the top end of the vocals, but then you keep sort of the middle end, and it starts to sound really shouty. So foam that's at least 4 inches thick on the back walls. And then you need, you know, on the side walls, he says you can put diffusers for music or movies, but he says you can use absorption, again, 4 inches thick, on the side walls for movies if you prefer. On the side and back walls, you put some more diffusers, and you put some absorption right in the back, in the center of the room behind you. And because that keeps it from sounding, you know, too ambient back there. And I'm really simplifying what he says, but this is the gist of it, and it's not that hard. He actually came to my house I had in LA a few years ago, and you know, because I said, look, I'll, you know, I used to live right by him, and he said, well, look, I'll come over, I'll see what you got. And he did, and he's like, yeah, do this, do this, do this. You need to move those here. You need to move those here. That was it. It wasn't like he came in and spent a day running measurements and giving me all these graphs and things like that. And plus, another thing that Floyd Toole stresses that I think a lot of people don't realize is that we adapt very readily to different acoustical environments. And the classic example I have is there's a gentleman named Laurie Fincham, who's kind of a legend in the audio industry.
Yes.
Ran CAF for many years. Is currently the chief scientist at THX. And I was at his house one time in Sonoma County in California, and he was talking about room correction, you know, that's built into AV receivers. And he said, well, we got into the discussion. Whenever I'm around him, we just never stop talking, because he's just such a kid. Anyway, we were on his the back porch of his home, and the discussion started there and carried into his car. And we're going to drive to THX's offices in San Francisco, and he says, we get in the car, and he says, look, I have to point out something to you. We just went from the back patio, which is an open, almost anechoic environment, except for the surfaces of the house, to the car, which is a completely opposite acoustical environment. And yet I can listen to your voice and I still know that it's Brent, and I don't start to go, oh, I need to EQ Brent's voice to sound right in the car. So that's one thing that we really neglect, and I think a lot of people in the industry kind of conveniently neglect it, because they want to sell you something to fix some problem, real or imagined. And we really do get used to things pretty fast. I can't get used to really bad speakers. I can't get used to Yamaha NS10Ms. I mean, I just never get used to them. They're just horrible, but they work for some people. I can't get used to a really bad Bluetooth speaker, but I can get used to an okay Bluetooth speaker that's $100 and it sounds fine for what it is. And I pretty quickly forget that I'm listening to a $100 Bluetooth speaker. So sorry, you can just flip the switch on me and I'll just keep talking forever.
No, so you're saying effectively that there's a lot of mind games which are also taking place in parallel along with the reproduction of the audio. Is that right?
Of course, it's because ultimately it's subjective, right? Ultimately, it's.
Would I be right in using the term psychoacoustics to also define that broadly?
Exactly, and the psychoacoustics is just so incredibly important, because what comes into our ears is a question, but ultimately what comes into our ears is processed, up here, and what our brain decides to do with it, it is really the big question, which is sometimes ignored in audio. And we tend to get, a lot of people get wrapped up in technical sort of things like the signal to noise and distortion of a DAC, for example, which above a certain level, which is pretty low, like something like, I don't know, minus 60 or 70 dB, it doesn't make a difference. We can't hear it. But from a psychoacoustical standpoint, if you see those measurements, you may come to believe that you can hear it, and that this happens all the time. And then, of course, our brains our ears are not that great, but our brains are fantastic, and our brains can process all sorts of sounds and do just incredible things. I mean, a great example for me is, if you're in a conversation with a whole lot of people at a big table, without doing anything physical other than maybe looking at the person, you can focus on one person's conversation at that table with some degree of success. Even though everyone's all at the same level, it's almost like your ears have noise canceling, and you can focus on things. Your brain is just an incredible tool for hearing, and I think that we just tend to forget that a lot. We tend to forget that the brain corrects for so many things that sometimes audio manufacturers claim are a problem, but maybe they're not.
Would I be also right in saying that the brain also corrects for maybe some biases with respect to the cost that you're paying for the equipment? So when you pay
Yeah. Well, that's a problem. See, that's the flip side of psychoacoustics, is that the incredible amount of bias that comes in, and there's just so much science that proves this, and there's no science that negates it, to my knowledge. But if you know the price of the gear, even if you are an expert, if you know the price of the gear, you will tend to prefer the more expensive gear.
Right.
Or if the gear has a more esteemed brand, if I give you what is that Bluetooth speaker over there? It's a Crossley. Okay, if I give you Crossley, which makes like cheap turntables in the US, if I give you, and you know that they make cheap turntables for like $50, and you see a Crossley Bluetooth speaker as opposed to a Sony, you're going to think the Sony sounds better unless you do a blind test. That's why I really like to do blind testing as much as I can. And there are other problems as well, like you're biased. If you're comparing a couple of products, you're biased by the first thing you hear, and you may develop a preference for the first thing you hear, or quite often, probably more often, you develop a preference for what's new. And like Floyd Toole says, new, therefore better. And you know, we tend to, this is why so many reviewers over the years, you know, they'll have, oh my gosh, this is my new reference amplifier. And they'll write a glowing review of some amplifier, and they'll say, oh my gosh, this is just the greatest thing ever, and whatever. But then, you know, next month or next year or something, they'll have another amplifier, and they'll be like, oh no, this is my new reference. This is the best thing ever. And you know, it's what it was. They used to joke about it back in the sort of heyday of the Absolute Sound, that you know, Harry Pearson was the president of the Amp of the Month Club, because you know, you'd have, oh, this is the best amp. Oh no, this is the best amp now, and it just kind of churns. Whereas in a blind test, you can't tell them apart, but you, because it's new, or because it has a cooler faceplate, or has a more esteemed brand name, or it costs more, or just because it's new, you think it's better. And this is why blind testing is so important to me. And it's also why blind testing would kill half the audio industry.
You're getting to almost bordering like a very controversial statement, so I'll stop you there.
But it's true.
It's just true. Yeah. Well, there are opinions on that too. So I had one topic which I wanted to ask you, and before we conclude this session and open it up for the audience. So yeah, would I be right in saying that there's also something known as a pride of ownership for an equipment? So as you said some time back, like people generally have a perception that the more they pay for an equipment, I'm not suggesting anyway that the costlier equipment would not necessarily perform better, but would I be right in saying that there is something known as a law of diminishing returns? So like there's some upper threshold beyond which every extra dollar or every extra currency that you pay is not necessarily going to yield the kind of returns that probably you would like to hear, or would you have a perception that it's going to really sound much better every dollar that you pay extra. So yeah, your thoughts on that?
Well, there's no question that there's a law of diminishing returns, and I can put together a system for you for $5,000 US, maybe 3,000, maybe less. That sounds absolutely fantastic, and it's 98% as good as anything else you're going to get. Because we have science, we know what works and we know what doesn't. And we have really inexpensive manufacturing these days, and we have very, very high efficiency manufacturing. So, just in the same way that I was talking about how, to do an 8-track recording used to cost $15,000 really to get started, and now it costs, well, you've already got the computer, and then it's another $200, and maybe a couple microphones. But it's one thing you touched on that I really want to talk about that makes home audio very different, and that's that we're buying consumer products, okay? And there's absolutely, in my opinion, nothing wrong with buying the consumer products that you like. And I do this as much as anybody. You know, I've got like some, you know, my main system is a couple of Parasound or a Parasound preamp. It's a fantastically good preamp, and it's got subwoofer output and all the stuff that I need. And then I've got a couple of Outlaw monoblock amplifiers. And in a blind test, you could put that up against pretty much anything on the market, and it would be a wash. You wouldn't be able to tell it from any, you know, properly functioning high-end gear. However, if I, and you know, part of the reason I have that stuff is I have to review speakers. You know, I have to have something that I know functions right and doesn't have any anomalies, right? Whereas if I were, if when I retire, which isn't, you know, that long from now, I will probably get an integrated tube amp that has EL84 tubes, because my very first integrated amp had EL84 tubes. It was a Heath kit my dad gave me, and I have fond memories of it. And like, you know, Bob Carver, who I know pretty well, has told me, you know, EL84 is his favorite tube and all that stuff. And I really want like a nice integrated amp with EL84s. And it's there's a huge pride of ownership. And, you know, there's guys who are into vintage audio, and they're so into the gear. And a lot of that gear, the amps tend to work perfectly fine. The speakers a lot of times are not good. But it doesn't matter. They like that sound, and you know, you get used to the sound. You can get some of those old Pioneers or JBLs that, you know, that had like the giant woofer and then the mid range and then the tweeter, right? And that doesn't. It can be made to work well, but it's really hard to get that design to work well acoustically. But still, they like that sound. It has that sound that they remember from their youth, or they like the look of it, or they like whatever it conjures up, or maybe they remember a music video that had that speaker in it. Who knows what, but for whatever reason, it gives them a really good feeling. And that plays so much into it for me, is you're buying gear that you like. Much like if you're buying a car, you know, you're probably not going to buy the car that is necessarily the most functional and appropriate for your use. You're going to buy a car that you like, right?
So it's an experience. So it's an experience which just is not pure oral. It's also visual. There's a lot of mental mind games going on, and a lot of other factors which basically which will basically eventually decide your opinion on a particular equipment or a piece of audio.
It's consumer products, you know.
Right.
It's not. These are not just tools to listen to music with.
Right.
These are products that we buy because we enjoy them. Just because, you know, you might buy. I'm in my kitchen. You might buy nice cookware because it's made really well. It's beautiful. You use it every day. It's like a watch. You know, nobody needs a watch because you have your phone, but you like having a watch. It looks, you buy like a nice Swiss watch or something like that. It looks cool. It kind of tells people that you have enough money to buy a Swiss watch. You know, you kind of, I have owned several. I don't now. I finally just gave up on it because I just found myself never using them. But I've owned several of them, and it's just really nice to have. There's no real good reason to have it. You know, and I could have an even worse shirt than this on, but I like this one. You know, my mom gave it to me. I think it looks nice. So
it does look nice.
thank you. But it's not all audio gear. We pretend that audio gear is all about functionality sometimes, and it's really not. Yeah, on the pro side, like you were talking about before, yeah, your USB interface is just about functionality, and most of them work fine. But on the consumer side, it's functionality, and it's partly whatever resonates with you, whatever you like, you know. And there's a lot of high-end audio gear that is just not as functional as more sort of mainstream products are. Well, I mean, and vinyl, you know, vinyl is just on a technical level, vinyl's not as good as streaming from some high quality streaming service, or maybe even as good as Spotify in some ways. But you know, it doesn't really matter. It's the whole owning experience of it.
I'm sensing a lot of people who are just gearing up to gun against you. So I throw open the floor to the audience right now. We'll have a small 5-minute discussion open to the audience, like all the participants. The floor is open to anyone who wants to ask questions. So I would request that you just raise your hand. There's an option of raising your hand and asking a question. So the floor is open. So we have approximately anywhere between 5 to 7 minutes, an open session for asking questions to Brent before we resume for the second part of the session. Yeah. So someone, if anyone has any questions, please raise their hand. There is an option of raising your hand on the on your panel on the top, the Zoom panel on the top. So please, or just I've unmuted everyone, so you're free to ask your questions by raising your hand. Anyone? Okay, if there aren't any questions, I would like KJ, being the recording and audio engineer on the panel, in the participants list. Is KJ, are you there?
Yeah. Yes, Karthik, I'm here.
Yeah, KJ, you have any observations or comments on? Can I unmute? Can I have your video also online? Just,
yeah, sure.
One second. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here.
Brent, KJ, as I told you, is a renowned name in the industry. So we're happy to have KJ. And KJ, you have any comments or observations on what Brent has told so far?
No comments as such quickly. I think I was just in a lot of agreement with what he had to say to certain things. I think more than anything else, the recording space, what he mentioned, I think is very critical because see, a listening space, you can still change. For example, you might change your house, you might change the room, you might change your speaker, and you might change the listening environment by going to a car or somewhere else. But a recording space is something which is going to decide what you're going to listen to. So I think it's far more critical to have a good recording space. And I've been guilty and I've been caught out many times by all my audiophile friends. I think maybe Khushro is here as well. Who brought me into this.
Khushro is grinning all the way.
Yes. So I have been caught out a lot of times in my recordings by audiophiles pointing out to me saying, hey, why is this brass sounding so acoustically compressed? Because obviously it's been recorded in a 12 by 14 room, so obviously it'll sound compressed. But thing is that if you're aware, you can only do things if you're aware of them. And if you make it a point to study, to get that knowledge, to be aware of it, is when you can start applying it. And as they all point out very rightly, it's very important to go and listen to concerts, especially acoustic instruments, which are without a PA if possible. And I wish I had known Brent plays double bass because we were looking for a double bass player last week, Brent, to record some jazz stuff.
I can phone it in. All my recordings that I've done on a kind of professional level, I have one live recording and I have one studio recording. We did it during the pandemic and we just sent each other files. And
yeah, now that's what happens. And I remember bringing the double bass into a studio which just cleared the top of the double bass by 2 inches. Wow. And we were saying, oh my, but we had no other option that time when we were recording it because everything else was shut. And that was the only studio available. But I do acknowledge that and I realize that, how space plays such an important role. And if you, like you said, very rightly, with the drum kit particularly, we recorded a recent one with a great room. And what ends up happening is that not only do you get a good tone and tonality, but you also end up spending less time in the mix or less time in trying to figure things out because it's already recorded well. It's the tone is already good. And I find that I'm using less and less of processing because it's been recorded so well. So how you record, what mic pre's, what mics, and one very important thing Brent said right in the beginning is when people recorded with the Neve console, that's all you had. And you spent the next 5 years of your life learning that console, and that's all. There was nothing else to learn. There was no, how do you know the EQ so well? How do you know the compressor, the fader, the routing so well? Because 5 years you only had, like, it's like having one car for the next 5-10 years of your life, and you know it inside out. But today we are spoiled for choice, as my friend Robert Scoville says, we are spoiled for choice. So there's very little time that most engineers have to delve through something before something new has come along. And this FOMO of being left out is so strong that we are always trying to catch up. And what do you have? What does he have? What does that guy have? And we are not investing that much time and space to study what we have. And that can only happen with hardware, because you can't really change it that fast. It's expensive, one. And secondly, it doesn't have presets. So you have to tweak the damn knobs to get what you want. And then you have to know it inside out, because the next time it'll be something else. So very rightfully, Brent pointed out all these things in the manner of his conversation. And I was just remembering that and agreeing in my head, saying, yeah, that's also right. That's also right. That's also right. So basically just affirming what Brent was mentioning, definitely. And I hope everybody takes home those points and kind of just assimilate that, what he just said. That was really good. Thanks, Brent.
I think
Thank you. It's great to hear a pro's perspective.
Yeah, I think just to summarize, I think we end up ignoring the space. Just to summarize, like small rooms have their own challenges in a very big way, especially on the recording as well as the reproduction side. So I think it's important to also realize that the equipment can be great, but a great equipment can sound very poor in a very poorly designed room, or let's say a room which is not doing justice to the equipment. So it's very important to take everything in perspective and design.
My room is a prime example, and thanks to again Kushro that we sorted it out. And it's a small room, and what Brent said, small rooms have their own nodes and zero nodes issues, but we managed to solve a lot of the issue by actually bringing down the size of the speaker rather than going the other way around. So from an 8-inch subwoofer, we actually are down to a 5-inch, which he first sent me on a loaner, was an Amphion EN Plus, which is a 5.5-inch speaker, two-way. And suddenly the difference between an 8-inch and a 5-inch, and now the speaker is working with the room rather than against it. And just by that simple decision, we managed to solve so many issues so quickly in that room. And even now, I'm on a PMC 5-inch speaker, and I find that it's translating pretty good out of what I'm working out of here in my room. And it's a small room, and it's not a large room by any chance. So acoustics, I think, very important part, how acoustics play a role and how we perceive and how we hear. Very, very critical, especially for recording engineers, because what we record and what we mix starts to become a reference for other people. And so we have to be very careful and cognizant of this, what we are doing. I just want to point that out.
I'm going to have Kushu also just make some comments. Kushu, I'm unmuting you. Kushu, you have any comments from your side?
Not comments as such, but coming to the playback side, because that's the part from where I come from. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you,
so yeah.
Yeah, we can. Can you have your
But of course, yeah. But yeah, sure. But in terms of how should I put it? Can I remove the video? It's really
no.
Yeah. So in terms of the playback side, and especially when we talk about high-end audio, the thing is that most people I have seen, with all due respect to Brent and the reviewing game, I've spent thousands of dollars on audio magazines and hi-fi magazines, and I just gave up a decade ago because it was I realized a long time ago it was the advertisements that spoke the review and not the other way around. Earlier reviewers were more sincere, but in the end, a publication has to live. But coming back with the high-end audio game, I think most people cringe away from high-end audio for several reasons. Is number one, when you hear a very high-end audio system and most of them are not set up very well. And when that happens, you start questioning, why would I spend this kind of money when I can do it in a fraction of the amount? And that's where you start coming up this argument of diminishing returns. That every rupee or dollar or pound or euro I spend extra, I start getting lesser and lesser returns, and unfortunately, there are only two things, being an economics student, I can tell you, which doesn't have diminishing returns. And that is money itself doesn't have diminishing returns. There is no limit to amount of money you can have. It never has diminishing returns. And sex doesn't have diminishing returns. It's true. I'm not joking. Sex doesn't have diminishing returns. Okay. That's part of the economic theory. And when these were written, there was no high-end audio. High-end audio does not have diminishing returns. Trust me, it does not have diminishing returns. When you hear a $25,000 system set up very well, and then you hear a $50,000 setup system sounding very well, you would say, does it sound twice as good? I've heard it sound 3 times as good.
So there could be an
exponential hockey curve.
Yeah. Okay.
So this concept of diminishing returns, I add one more always in the economic theory. It's money itself, it's sex, and high-end audio. In these 3, diminishing returns don't apply. Because I've heard some severely engineered rooms with severely engineered gear, and people will be suspect of cable. I've heard in blind test, I won't say brand wise, but you say cable A, B, C, D, you have 4 cables. A bunch of guys who are highly trained in their hearing, and just the power cable in the DAC changes. No other cable, just the power cable in the DAC changes. And every time I have heard those guys say cable A, cable B, cable C, cable D. And you flip it the other way around, they will go C, B, D, A.
So you're talking about a pure blind test?
Pure blind test. Okay. I mean, the eyes are open. Their eyes are open. I am against closing your eyes, because the minute you close your eyes, your sensory systems go for a toss.
Okay.
The human psychology cannot work with your eyes closed. It does not work. You have to have your eyes open. You look away, you do what you do, be fair to yourself.
Okay.
And for the sake of being fair to ourselves, we have done this several times, and within our own group, we have done it several times in India. Now, here's going to be an interesting paper, because I was sitting with an Indian guy who's a highly capable engineer, and he's written a paper which is submitted right now to the EES and has gone for ratification.
Okay.
He'll probably be giving a talk in Finland.
Okay.
He's a Milind Puchnur.
Okay.
He's a friend's cousin. Okay.
Yes.
Milind has written a paper like the eye, the human eye can see about, I think, in a color gamut, some 3 million or 10 million shades. I'm not very sure.
Okay.
But the human ear is, he says 3 to the power of 3 into 10 to the power of 15 or something like that. Some weird number that the human ear can hear shadings.
Okay.
We are not talking about loudness, SPL. He's talking about shading. A slight change, and our human ear and brain is capable of hearing that shading. He's going to present the paper in Finland, I think, in May.
Okay.
Or April or May. I'm not very sure, which will be very interesting.
So when you say shading, would timbre be a very weak representation of that term? Or?
Timbre is only one aspect of it.
One aspect, exactly. One aspect.
Timbre is only one aspect of it. So shading is far more complex. Because that was what was asked: is timbre what it is? And he said, so timbre is only one aspect of shading.
Okay.
Okay. So it's far more than that.
So shading is shading a term which is accepted in the audio industry? I'm hearing that term for the first time.
So see, the thing is that he's going to give the paper now.
Okay.
So how he terms it is something, even he's looking for a terminology which describes it,
Right.
So we'll wait for the paper, I guess. It's a highly technical paper. I saw it and I said, this is math that I never want to see in my life.
Okay.
All right. I mean, because he's an expert in superconductivity and stuff like that at a world level.
Right.
So my point is, high-end audio is a hobby. It's a very serious hobby. And there is, and when you do this game, there are severely rich people who are involved in it, And I always tell everybody, rich people are not stupid. They're rich because they are not stupid. And for us to assume that, meeting many high-end audio clients, we say, in India, we have this very thing, he's got money, he doesn't understand anything. No. If he decides to put 1 week into it, he will teach you your trade.
Okay.
So never underestimate a rich man who spends money.
That's a nice way of putting it. Thanks, Vishnu. I'll get back to Brent. Let's get back to the part 2 of the
Can
session.
we take a 5-minute break for water or something like that?
Sure. Okay.
2-minute break, just a 2-minute break. Yeah.
No problem.
Okay.
So I will.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just mute myself. Okay. You can start. I'll mute. Okay. Yeah. Bye.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Vishnu. So we get back to Brent. I'll maybe take a 1-minute break for the benefit of everyone. You can maybe have a bio break or have a glass of water or whatever you want. We'll take a 1-minute break. I'll be exactly back at 9:40 India time. We are actually running short of time because we didn't anticipate this good questions and it to go this way. So I'm going to be cutting down the time allotted for the second part, which is Dolby. Although that topic is probably more interesting than the current one. let's just take it as it goes. If anyone has got Brent, do you have any time constraint on your end? I'm unmuted, Brent.
I don't. I'll stay on as long as you want.
Oh, wonderful, and that's great.
Not
to hear.
like 4 hours.
No. So yeah, interestingly, there is a very important festival today. Rather, it's not a festival. It's an auspicious day. It's called Mahashivratri in India. So it's a religious event. So a lot of people, and interestingly, the function begins towards the latter half of the day, or I would say more towards the night side. So we would have to necessarily end the session closer to, I would say, a hard stop at around 10. So which is your time. I believe it would be 8:30 your time.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So we maybe spend about 20 odd minutes more, and 20 to 25 minutes at a max, and we call an end to the session. So yeah. So let's begin the part 2 of the session, which is basically Dolby Atmos. And Dolby, as you all know, is the global leader in setting standards and with regards to anything got to do with audio, both on the recording side of the chain as well as the reproduction side of the chain. So some interesting things which come up to mind is, why has Dolby been the predominant player in the market? There were so many other companies prior to Dolby which basically started talking about what is known as, like, loosely put, spatial audio. But why is Dolby where it is, and why is, let's say, a company like BTS or Oro is probably almost not existent? Why is that the case? So that it's a very interesting question and very interesting thing to observe, that we don't see Oro. A lot of people loved Oro, but Oro is nowhere to be seen in the market. So why is that so? Brent, some thoughts from your side?
Okay. First of all, I should preface this by saying I do not have a pro Dolby bias. I did work there for a couple years, but I didn't get out of there with any stock options or anything like that, and which kind of annoys me. But I don't have a pro Dolby bias, and frankly, it's been a while, and I am not sure who I know there anymore. I was there back in the days when Ray Dolby was still there and still alive, and you know, I kind of knew. I came up with. I was there for a lot of the sort of classic people that built that company. It's a completely different company now. I mean, it's run by completely different people. And like I said, I don't know a lot of people there still. It's also 2 or 3 times bigger than it was when I worked there. But Dolby has been in the licensing. Dolby almost invented the licensing game. And you know, that way back in the day with Dolby B, noise reduction for cassettes, and which, by the way, I mean, it was Henry Close's idea. It was not Ray Dolby's idea. Henry Close, you know, gave Ray Dolby the idea. To give credit where credit is due, and I'm incredibly proud to say I knew both of those guys pretty well. But anyway, Dolby's really good at this. Dolby knows what they're doing, and Dolby has always been a well-run company. And you know, DTS, there was a company called SRS that actually, I think, more or less pioneered the idea of object-based audio, which is what Atmos is based on, which means you can, instead of having the sound assigned to, you know, one of 7 channels, let's say, you can just, the sound is just assigned certain X, Y, and Z coordinates in.
And you can steer
Yeah, you can steer it as you have an object, which is a audio file of, say, a dog barking or something, and you can put it wherever you want to, both height and, in 3 dimensions. So SRS kind of had a system going for that was working, and they were talking to pros about, moving from Dolby, which had kind of played around with the idea of height speakers back when with Dolby Pro Logic 2Z, and it didn't really work, to tell you the truth. And so SRS had come out with this technology. They were trying to push the studios to do it, but Dolby got wind of it. Meanwhile, DTS bought SRS, and I'll just tell you right now, DTS is not like my favorite company, and they tend to not launch things in a timely fashion and coordinated fashion, and my feelings about them go back a long ways. But DTS bought SRS, and they kind of came up with DTS-X, but DTS is not necessarily an audio focused company now. They have all kind of other irons in the fire, and they started to push for it, and they were ahead of Dolby, but then Dolby came out with Atmos, which is basically like a 7.1 system with objects tacked onto it. So it had a certain familiarity for the people that mix movie sound. So they could go like, oh, well, I can just do a 7.1 mix like I've been doing, and then add this stuff on top. So there's a huge comfort level, and they knew that since it was Dolby, they would get technical support. They would have support from software manufacturers. They knew there'd be a Pro Tools plugin that works right, that's not kludged together that they're going to fight with every day. That's actually going to, and KJ, I'm sure, would go along with this, that like, you want things that work. You don't want to have to be fighting your gear every single day of your job. And I think there was a huge comfort level with Dolby, and people didn't really trust DTS to do that. So Dolby kind of got out ahead, and then Dolby was just smart about when Dolby introduced Atmos. I was at the main event that they did in Hollywood to do that, and it was incredibly impressive. And normally you go to press events, and most of the press are like, oh, this is stupid. Everyone was impressed. Everyone was like, wow, this is a really impressive demo. They've really thought this thing out. And when DTS introduced DTS-X, everyone was like, well, this is ridiculous. The general impressions of the press were nothing like that. And since then, Dolby has come out with it in soundbars, and many other products. Dolby has it, has Atmos in phones. Dolby has Atmos in my Amazon Echo Studio speaker, in the new Apple HomePod. And they've partnered with Apple, and Apple's really pushing immersive sound, and they've gone out to the record companies and really pushed this. And if you look at the pro audio magazines, there's talk of Atmos in almost every article. Whether the big question is on the movie side, Atmos is a done deal. It's a standard. No, for a lot of movies, you don't really need Atmos. You don't benefit from it. More character-driven movies, but for your big Marvel action movies, yeah, sure, of course, they're all going to be in Atmos for forever, or at least until the next thing comes along. With movies, the big question mark is a lot of people are saying, well, yeah, Atmos is kind of cool, and there's a lot of excitement about it right now, but maybe it'll be gone in a couple years, just like surround sound music. There was all kinds of excitement about it 20 years ago, and some stuff was done and it was forgotten. So we'll see, but Dolby has done an extraordinary job, I think, of when I can look around. Granted, I'm a reviewer, so I got tons of stuff, but when I could just look around my house and see all these different things that have Atmos, that's pretty great. That's a huge win for them.
Okay, I think that there's a question which comes to mind. I have seen so many revisions of let's say, the documents which come out from Dolby in terms of, let's say, the standards that they set. Dolby Atmos over a period of, let's say, the last 3 to 4 years has seen so many revisions in its approach and the way the implementation is to be done. So doesn't that basically showcase a confused kind of a, let's say, a implementation, or let's say the engineering side of it? It just throws open that that kind of impression. So correct me if I'm wrong.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
It's a pro and a con. I've talked to engineers about this, recording engineers who are doing Atmos, and some of them, so what Atmos does is it's what they call it mapping. So if you have a sound that's supposed to be right here, let's say, it's the coordinates, and the coordinates will map onto whatever device that you have, whether it's a simple sound bar, or it's a 13-channel audio system, home theater system, or a phone with just headphones, or who knows what. But it will map onto all those things. So no matter what you do in your mix, the Atmos system will figure it out and do a reasonable reproduction of it. The problem is this: for mixing 7.1 sound, let's say, the mixing or even stereo, the mixing engineer has some reasonable idea of what kind of system it'll be played back on. So, yes, home theater systems vary a lot, but they're still kind of a basic layout. And even sound bars, there's kind of a basic layout to it, that, some certain expectations that you can have if you're mixing for things like that. Whereas for Atmos, you could have, I have this Amazon Echo speaker in the next room that has, it's like this big, and it's got, I don't know what drivers are in there, you can't see, but it's got a top firing driver to sort of make it more immersive. And some of these sound bars will have top firing drivers. Some of them have top firing drivers in the surround speakers. Some of them don't have top firing drivers. Some of them have beamforming. Some of them don't have beamforming. And the engineers, I talked to Elliot Shiner about this, who's a really famous recording engineer, and he was frustrated that he just doesn't know what to mix for, because he can mix on his studio system, which I'm going to presume has a couple of ceiling speakers in the front, a couple ceiling speakers in the back, standard 7.1 setup. In addition to that, he can mix for that, but how does he know how that's going to translate onto the Amazon Echo Studio? Well, he can't send it to the Amazon Echo Studio. Now he can send it to some headphones, but as we know, all headphones sound different, and headphones have a different spatial presentation as well.
Yes.
So it's tough to know, as a mixing engineer, it's kind of tough to know exactly how your Atmos product is going to be played back. However, as an amateur recording engineer and mixer, who has contemplated adding Atmos, I can say that you can just think of Atmos as just something that adds some extra height ambience, right? Because that's the one thing it has that existing systems don't have, right? For 7.1, you can do a great wraparound effect, and Atmos doesn't really add anything to that. What it really adds is the height stuff.
For want of a better term, it's just adding an extra dimension to the presentation.
Yeah, so that's the real bottom line thing that Atmos brings you. And if you're a jazz guy like me, maybe you want to try to recreate an ambience that's more like like KJ was talking about, the importance of the room in recording. Well, with Atmos, you could record maybe trumpets in a small room, and you could add some height ambience to it in Atmos and make it sound like it's not a crummy little room, like it's a good studio, or like it's the old 30th Street Columbia studios in New York, where Kind of Blue was recorded. And I've heard there's a lot of Blue Note Atmos. Blue Note's done hundreds of Atmos mixes, Blue Note jazz label. And God, some of them are just amazing. They really sound like you're in a real, like Capitol Studio A or something in Los Angeles, you know, really good recording studio. And that stuff is worth exploring. And it's like, if you're the mixing engineer and maybe people are listening on a great system and they really get that ambience, well, great. But, you know, maybe they're just listening on the new Apple HomePod and it adds a little bit of that ambience. Well, better than nothing, I think. So it's a complicated thing, but the nice thing is that it's not. I have not done an Atmos mix, but I have a friend who's got a full-on Atmos mixing system that he kind of took me through the process, and it's not really that hard to do, and you know it's a real mix. So it's like, yeah, you don't know how it's going to be reproduced, and there's just so many. And Dolby, you know, to their credit on the business side, but to their
peril,
detriment to some extent on the actual aesthetic side, Dolby is pretty much willing to slap the Atmos label on anything. I mean, it's on 2.0 channel soundbars.
That's a bit of a negative side of the Atmos ecosystem. Actually, it brings me to another question. Like the point is that you talked about the concept of mapping, which Atmos is basically trying to do. It's trying to map the various objects with respect to the particular sound where it is coming from. On the same lines, I think Dolby, or let's say any company which is into this concept of immersive sound, should also focus on maybe mapping the reproduction side with respect to the equipment which is on, sorry, mapping the recording side with the corresponding way of implementation on the reproduction side, because as you said, Dolby Atmos is slapped on literally every single thing, like a mobile phone, a soundbar, any piece of audio equipment. And at sometimes you're quite baffled, and you wonder, like, is it practical, or is it actually implementable? So this is a question which I think needs to be posed to Dolby. Like, they need to probably streamline their the thought process and try to do a 1:1 good mapping between the reproduction side and the recording side, in terms of, let's say, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Some base level standards need to be probably defined. I'm just putting these terms in a very loose way. I'm sure you understand. I hope you have understood the crux of the question.
Well, they're making money, so they're not going to change what they're doing, because at this point somebody doesn't like it. And Dolby definitely, if Dolby's making money, I can tell you this part of the corporate culture still exists there.
Yes.
If they're making money, they don't care that much about what. They're always going to have their critics, because they're for what they are. For an audio licensing company, they're big, and they're perceived to be much bigger than they are because their logos all over everything.
It's a very well-oiled machine.
Yeah, so they're not going to care. I mean, when I was there, we had so many. Everything we did, we had detractors, but on the pro side, I think they care more. So if they get pushback from a mixing engineer who says, "Hey, I don't like this because of this." Well, you're going to have mixing engineers that don't like almost whatever you do, but they do take the feedback in terms of. But usually, by the time they've launched the product, they've already been to all the studios and they've already talked to all the engineers about it, and they've gotten their feedback. They do a really good job. They deserve their success on this, and it's something that's interesting. I should say that one of the neatest things I've heard is there's one of the things that Blue Note has done, which may sound weird, but it really works, is they do what's called reamping, where they actually take the recording and they play the recording back through speakers in a studio, and then they record that to get a realistic picture of the studio's ambience. And then they fold that into the existing mix to give you sort of the ambience. And you would think that's a horrible idea, because you're taking the recording, which in jazz might well just be a stereo recording, and there might not be any extra tracks or stems you can pull from. And they're piping it out into the studio, and they're using a lot of microphones. You have the coloration of the speaker, the coloration of the microphone, in addition to the coloration of the room, which is what you're trying to capture.
Right.
But if you listen to the recording they have of Wayne Shorter's tune "Infant Eyes," on even like a good Atmos soundbar, or like the Apple Pro Max headphones or whatever, it is just amazing. It sounds like you're in a studio, like you're in a really good big studio. I think that was recorded at the old 30th Street Columbia Studios, if I remember correctly. Might have been Van Gelder, but it was in a good studio. It was Wayne Shorter, you know, and there was Blue Note. Yeah, so it was Blue Note. So it must have been, I think it was Van Gelder. But anyway, so it was done in a really good studio with really good musicians who had good instruments, who had great sound. And to hear it reproduced with that sort of ambience, like you're actually in a studio. And I've been in, lots of studios. I've kind of gotten some picture of what a good sounding studio sounds like when you play there. And it's just an amazing thing. So incredible things can be done with it. Well, of course, horrible things will be done with it too. The nice part of it is that you don't really have to listen to all that. You can, I mean, if someone wants to do something like putting a mandolin up above your head, which I don't know, that might work for something, but I can't imagine it working for anything. But if someone wants to do that, they can do it. But when it comes through your headphones or through your Amazon Echo speaker, it's just going to sound like it's not going to sound like mandolin above your head. It's going to sound like kind of somewhat spacey mandolin. Or not. It might just sound kind of like an ambient mandolin sound, and that's probably okay. I just want to say, there's two things. There's two different perspectives on music that I see in the world that I inhabit, and I see the musician's perspective, where musicians are interested in, melody, harmony, and rhythm of a piece of music. They're interested in the instrumental sounds, like, does the sax player sound good?
Right.
To them, at least. They're not really so interested. It's almost digital in a way that musicians think about music, because they are decoding that music, and they're going, yes, the guitar player is doing this, and and the bass player is doing this, and the drummer is doing this, and it interlocks in this way, and they change up, and oh, that's cool. They changed up something for the chorus to keep your ear interested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas audiophiles are like, listen to how spacious it sounds, or listen to how natural the voice sounds, or something like that. And they tend to think about things in that more, in a way that is very different from the way that musicians perceive it. And this is why I think most musicians don't worry too much about having good audio gear.
Right.
They don't need it. They can listen to a Bluetooth speaker for $50, and their decoder works just as good with that as it. I mean, yeah, maybe you can't hear the deep bass notes, but you can still hear Ron Carter through it, because it's double bass, so the fundamental is not that strong. I can listen to a new Ron Carter record off of a Bluetooth speaker and still, will it sound as good as it does on a good stereo? Absolutely not even close. But I can still decode it 100% off the Bluetooth speaker. I can decode it off the little speakers in my phone, maybe. I mean, if I'm lifting tunes off of, if I want to learn a part from a tune, if I hear a bass lick or guitar lick that I like on a record, and I want to just copy it to see what it was, I just listen on. I just put my phone speaker on and sit down with my guitar, my bass, or whatever, and learn it. I don't need to have a fancy reproduction system to do that.
Right. But just to summarize this discussion, do you think, from being an person who has worked with Dolby in the past, do you think that they need to be more accountable in terms of what they are getting implemented in the market? Because there is also forget about the commercial aspects about the way it works, but there also ought to be some kind of mandatory standards in terms of what are essential in good reproduction and things like that. Like from the point of view of a good implementation of the way you want your system to be. Do you think that Dolby need to do some introspection on that regard? Or you're happy in saying that, okay, they're making the money, so it's okay, everything is okay in that sense?
Well, here's the thing. It's like I would be happy if my dog obeyed me, but she's not going to, okay? And so I don't worry about it. Dolby's kind of the same way. It's like, I know they're not going to, they sort of leave that to reviewers. They leave it to people like me who say, look, Atmos, if you do, it's a great website. Well, I guess you can get them anywhere in the world. Audioholics does probably the most opinionated writing on this subject. Right. And, you know, they've done a really good job of pointing out, like, look, you don't have ceiling speakers, it's not real Atmos. And if you really want the experience, you have to get ceiling speakers. There are no shortcuts. As much of a pain as it might be to put speakers in your ceiling, you have to do it. And they are right, absolutely right. The Atmos experience with ceiling speakers is far better than anything else. And the little speakers that shoot up, you know, the Atmos enabled speakers that supposedly bounce off your ceiling.
It's an emulation. It's an emulation of. It's probably an emulation of that particular.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's
poor emulation.
It's kind of just. It's kind of, you don't have the discrete sounds coming from up above. You just have this kind of general ambience. And the same with the sound bars. The sound bars can't do the real sounds from above, but it gives you a nice ambience. But Dolby kind of leaves it to reviewers, like people like me or like Audioholics, who to explain those differences to you and to say, hey, look, if you want the real thing, you gotta pop for ceiling speakers. But you know, you can get these Atmos enabled up firing speakers, and that's pretty good. Or you can get a sound bar, and I got to tell you, the Atmos, the Atmos sound bars, the up firing speakers, they don't bounce sound off the ceiling really. They bounce sound off of everything because that's the way speakers work. And but still, it sounds better than in general, the Atmos equipped sound bars sound better than the non-Atmos equipped ones, and they have a bigger sound that sounds more like a real home theater system. On the headphone side, you know, there's nothing, I don't see that there's anything you can do to make headphones more Atmos compatible. Apple keeps claiming that they do that, but they're not really specific, and I don't hear it. So I just think that Dolby's going to leave that to people like me to point out, and they don't care what I say. They don't care what Gene Della Sala says. They're probably not going to disagree. You know, Gene Della Sala from Audioholics. They're probably not going to, even though Gene will come out and tell you, you know what, the up firing speakers are stupid. Don't get those. I think that's what he says. Sorry, Gene, if I'm misrepresenting you. But he's told me he thinks they're stupid. Anyway, so if Gene says you have to get the ceiling speakers, probably the Dolby engineers are going to agree privately. They won't come out with a press release that says you must do this, because they're going to lose too much money. They want to sell sound bars. They're making money on sound bars, not on receivers.
So they choose to be they leave the audience, or let's say the reviewers, to engage with the end customer and give a better perspective of what works better in what space.
Right, and they're very comfortable with that, as opposed to the days when it was Dolby versus DTS, and the reviewers, for the most part, were not equipped to do a legitimate comparison, and almost none of them did. And I actually tried, and my comparison it wasn't great, frankly. I didn't have the tools. David Renata from Stereo Reviewer Sound and Vision, I can't remember what it was called at the time, he actually was probably the only one that did a really legit comparison. And Dolby, I will tell you, as their former marketing guy, had a contentious relationship with a lot of the press back then. But nowadays they really don't, because like I said, I don't think their engineers would disagree with what the reviewers say, but you know, the engineers are like, hey, you know, we're gonna by you know, charging Samsung whatever they charge Samsung to put
license
Atmos in this phone, because this phone has a little switch for Atmos. Dolby, you know, Samsung sells a ton of these phones, and for God's sake, you know, I don't know what their deal with Apple is, but it's in so many Apple products. It's in, you know, I try to test every soundbar on the market. Obviously you can't, but it's in more than half the soundbars I test now. It's in every AV receiver. You know, it's a giant win for them. They're making, the licensing business is tough, but they're making good money on this.
Yeah, the cost of sounding a bit controversial. I would say that if everyone is making money, including Dolby and also the OEMs like Samsung, Apple, so I think all is well.
Yeah, they're fine. They're not going to. Plus, Dolby, like many other companies, is reluctant to publish standards above and beyond what they need to do.
Right.
Dolby I haven't seen one of their standards books for years. I have not seen the Atmos standard books. The standard books for Dolby Digital for manufacturers were spectacularly good. Everything was laid out, like how to implement Dolby Digital, how Dolby Digital works, what you have to do, et cetera, et cetera. But there was nothing, to my knowledge, ever written down about what to actually do with Dolby Digital if you were a sound mixer. Maybe they had some very brief, very simple things. So on the Atmos side, they do have technical documents that show you how to set up an Atmos system and kind of give you the gist of it, but they're not going to say, oh, well, there needs to be a standard that says that you do this and you do this and you map this to this, because they're already doing the mapping, and they're not going to tell people what to do with this. And plus, you know, recording engineers like to have, in my experience, like to have some guidelines. They like to know how to get the stuff working, but once they get the stuff working, they want to rely on their ears and do the things that seem to work to them, because that's what their clients are paying them for. They're the people that they work for generally trust those engineers. Otherwise, why hire them? Right. So you know, I mean, you know, well-known engineers are expensive, and you can always find somebody to do it much cheaper, but you hire the well-known person because you trust their ears. Yeah. So, you know, if I had an actual recording, well, I am on a record label, but if I had like a real like big name recording contract and had some money to spend on recordings, I would hire, you know, get someone like an Elliot Shiner to work on it, because he's done all these famous records, and I would trust him to do it more than I trust myself or trust some guy down the block.
Sounds fair. I think you have summarized the entire the topics quite well. I think it's pretty much like, I think we are probably close to the end of the session. I think I'll open the floor to the audience for any questions that they might have. So I'm going to unmute everyone again. So if anyone has any questions, I think we have ended the session. So Khushru has got a question. So Khushru, please go ahead.
It's not so much as a question.
Okay.
Actually, two things. Brent, what did you think of the Miles Davis? Because I think that was the first Atmos where the speakers and the mics were put to around to capture the ambience. So the Miles Davis, I think, done in Capitol was the first one that probably did that. What did you think of that capture or that Atmos mix?
I have to confess, I can't remember. I'm sorry.
You haven't heard the Miles?
No, I remember hearing it. I just can't remember what it sounded like. I think, honest to God, I've heard so many reissues of Kind of Blue that I just don't care about it. And also, we were talking about psychoacoustics before. Kind of Blue is all stored in here. I bought that record in 1979.
Right.
And I've heard it so many times, I don't listen to it anymore. I can play all the tunes on bass from memory, and frequently do, you know, on gigs. Those tunes still get called all the time. And you know, so I'm a little biased that as soon as Kind of Blue comes on, I kind of stop paying attention. It's not that. It's not. It's like, okay, yeah, Kind of Blue, whatever. I want to hear some lesser known Blue Note recording that was, you know, I'm more into like the Van Gelder recordings, because frankly, I have a mental picture of what a Van Gelder recording sounds like, even though there are lots of different sounding Van Gelder recordings. But yeah, I'm sorry, I just kind of turn off when Kind of Blue comes on. I kind of quit paying attention.
Okay. Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to talk about this Atmos thing was Atmos will allow, from the musician point of view, to now make music in a dimensional way of telling a story in a completely hyper reality, if I may say so, you know, involvement, you know. So for example, if you hear now what Steven Wilson, if you hear his Atmos album, which won the best immersive album, and you hear the compositional way in which they go about it, because now they have this extra dimension of conveying a story. I think in the future, a lot of composers and musicians will look at it in a different way than what we as audiophiles or we as consumers look at it. You know, I mean that is going to be a different way. Like for example, Hans Zimmer, and if you hear his interview for the movie Dune, you know, about how he engages noise as a part of the entire structure, and that can never happen in a 2-channel system, you know, because the noise is something which will probably come from behind, or as you say, as a XYZ coordinate somewhere, you know, as a part of a composition. So I think we need to also look at Atmos from a creative point of view. How it will change the musicians and the production
the creativity, the room for creativity.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a story being told from the front. It is a story that is being told all around you.
All around. Fair enough. Very well taken point.
I actually, can I comment on that?
Please.
I agree completely. The thing about, because I agree with exactly who you mentioned. Steven Wilson is extraordinary in his ability to think in that way, and also in his interest in this stuff, because most musicians don't care about it. In fact, he gets so much work because so many of these old, you know, progressive rock bands are just kind of like, yeah, we don't really get this stuff, but we know that you do, and we know that you understand our music. So here, you mix this, and he just does a pretty fantastic job, and he really embraces that stuff. And then film composers, of course, all of them. I shouldn't say film, you know, because so much of everything is on TV now, but people who compose for film and for movies and TV, they all understand that, and they tend to embrace it because of the different atmospheric things they can do with it. Getting normal musicians to think in that way is hard.
Hard. I agree.
They tend to not, like I was talking about before, they think in terms of, you know, melody, rhythm, and harmony.
It's a conditioning that they have, preconditioning.
Right. So they are a lot less concerned with presentation. So we need more Steven Wilsons, basically. I mean, who is the other Steven Wilson? He's kind of one of a kind. I'm sure there's somebody else like that, but there's not. You know, I read Tape Op magazine religiously. It's my favorite magazine, and it's like there's so many people in there that are like, oh yeah, this Atmos thing looks pretty cool. I should start looking into that. And Atmos has been out for I don't know how long, a long time now. So it's still getting there. I hope that younger people will I wish more younger people could hear exactly what you just said, because then they'd see it as an artistic thing. But this is not taught in music schools. It's not taught, it's not really discussed among any of the musicians I know. And Stephen Wilson is unfortunately kind of one of a kind, and we need a lot more Stephen Wilsons out there. We'll get them, I think.
Right. KJ, any questions from your side? Any observations from your side? Being from the, I would like to
no, not really in terms of anything else. I think Brent has already talked about a lot of the things that he's mentioned, and there was only this thing about Dolby setting a standard, and I think, like Brent very rightfully said, that they've set a standard as to how things have to be connected and how things have to be done. But on the creative side of it, or anything else, it has to be left on the engineers and their interpretation, and people like Stephen Wilson and the other people who are going to use a newer form. Like when we switched from mono to stereo, I mean, there was no other definition except that there is going to be a separate left speaker and a right speaker, but there was no other definition. Everything was left to the engineers. And that's why you'll hear early Beatles recording, the drums are on the left, the bass was on the right. And then slowly people started kind of figuring out how best to use stereo. We are in early stages, even though Dolby Atmos has been here for a while, but
right.
We are still in early stages of like, how do we use this technology? How do we use this to our benefit? It'll take a while. And I think we'll get there at some point or the other. It will get there. And as usual, Dolby is pumping in a lot of energy and money and everything into it, throwing a lot into it to make sure that it kind of outlives. And it's because if it permeates everywhere, then it'll have to be there. And like Brent said very rightfully, all the stuff that he's reviewing almost has Dolby either vision in terms of visual or a Dolby Atmos on some immersive somewhere or the other. So they are making sure that it outlives, even if their interest somewhere kind of dwindles, but it'll outlive that. Once it does that, crosses that boundary, it's going to stay. And once that happens, then people will start getting interested because it's there, and they have to make it cheaper all around as well in terms of, deliverables. Only Apple is carrying it right now. Other platforms have to start carrying it. Other platforms have to start ingesting it. All that will happen. And once that starts to happen, I think you will see a lot more interesting things coming up.
Wonderful. Thanks, KJ. Brent, I'll also take the opportunity of introducing Mr. Ram. Ram sir is basically the one of the co-founders of RNS Electronics and also Pulse Electronics, the company which I was talking about. They are a pro. They primarily came out of the pro audio side, but they also have some very interesting products on the home front. So, Ram sir, any questions or any observations from your side?
Well, hello, Brent. He has covered most of it, in a very nice way, and I'm very happy, to learn a few things from Brent. I just have one short question. Would you like to say a couple of words about Oro 3D?
Brent, did you hear the question? I just
I have to confess, I don't really know much about it. I've heard it in trade shows. I've been to some of their press events. But you as a reviewer, you see these things come in, and it's in a lot of higher end, not even a lot. It's in some higher end AV receivers, and it doesn't, to me, seem to really do anything that Atmos doesn't already do. In the same way as DTS-X, they had promised a lot of extra features and interesting things, but they didn't really do it. And I don't really, it's nice to have competition, but I don't really see a need for it. It may have, I honestly, I haven't heard an Oro 3D demo in quite some time. And I just don't think that, you can have these formats and they may have some little advantage over what Dolby's doing here or there, but people are going to stick with the Dolby implementation because it works, it's fine. If you can't make a good mix with Atmos, then you can't make a good mix, okay? With any other immersive format. I mean, there's a lot of people that can make a good stereo mix and can't make a good Atmos mix, which is fine. But I don't really, that's one of the big problems with competing with Dolby, and DTS has been, in my opinion, guilty of this, is that, it just ends up being, Dolby is the real sort of workhorse format or technology, and other people tack on with other technologies that are an alternative because they can throw a little bit of advertising money or PR money out there and create the sense that you need to have this, and they can get it included on certain pieces of software, and therefore audio enthusiasts will think, well, I need to have DTS-X or whatever because there are certain Blu-ray discs that are encoded in DTS-X. And yeah, you kind of do, if you have an AV receiver, you kind of have to have DTS-X. And if you have a sound bar, there's certain things you can't do unless you have DTS-X. But there's no aesthetic reason why, you need to have DTS-X. And, once you go to streaming, DTS-X doesn't, to the best of my recollection, exist at all. So you're already into Dolby formats at that time because that's the standard. At least in the US, I think there are other places where MPEG variants are the standard. But you kind of can't escape Dolby, and at least in this sector of the market, it's pointless to try to compete with them on immersive sound. I mean, I have a good friend that used to work at DTS, and he was when Dolby came out and Dolby did their introduction and was so successful, he was just like, well, the game's over. We can't beat that.
Right.
We can't create a we don't have enough to offer to compete with them.
Right.
And enough money as a who's saying that? KJ was saying, Dolby throws money at things when they need to.
Right. Thank you.
The interesting aspect, I must add, Brent, for your information, the company that Ramsar is basically co-owning and he runs the company, they are very much involved in the implementation of Dolby Atmos in various spaces, including studios and various other commercial spaces. And their company was one of the early adopters of Dolby in the country, in India. So I'm sure Ramsar and you would be having a lot of common friends, which you can.
We work with the Dolby for 30 years.
Oh wow! Okay, longer. Yeah, that's as long as I've been around in this industry.
Right from optical stereo to
oh wow,
Atmos implementation.
So way back. I should say, I should add something though, that it's so in AV receivers especially.
Yes.
They tend to have so much DSP horsepower nowadays that you can kind of dump anything you want in there. It's just software. And so for a lot of, I shouldn't say for a lot of AV receiver manufacturers, because there aren't a lot of AV receiver manufacturers now, but for them, for the Sonys and Yamahas and Denon Marantz, it's not usually that difficult to add these things to. It's a little bit of programming and software implementation and getting it into their user interface, but it's not really that big of a deal, especially because the only companies left in the AV receiver business are super competent companies, and they have the capability to add these things without a whole lot of effort or complications on their part. When I was at Dolby, it was different because there were a lot of high-end companies doing their own implementations of Dolby Digital, and I would constantly tell them, don't do that, don't do it, go to, like Momentum Data Systems was one of the big ones back then. Go to Momentum Data Systems and get a card from them and put that in your receiver. Don't try to build Dolby Digital on your own, because you'll waste a ton of money and it won't work. And but the companies that are left in that business, you know, the high-end companies by and large don't do that anymore, with a few exceptions like Trinoff, who are super competent. So by and large, though, it's so for a company to add Oro to its products is like, well, that's fine, and you're going to have a couple pieces of software. And you know, for you know, Vizio, which is a big company in the U.S. here, has DTS:X in a lot of their sound bars. It doesn't cost them a lot of money. I don't know what the licensing is on that, but it's costing them $1, $2. And they can throw that in their sound bar, and their sound bar will work better with that relatively small number of Blu-ray discs that have DTS:X, if you know, for the dwindling number of people that are watching Blu-ray discs.
Right. Interesting. Thank you.
So yeah, you can throw it in there. Why not?
Right.
A couple bucks.
It's a software.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we need to be closing the session. If there aren't any more questions,
I have one thing.
Oh yeah, Kushal, please go on. Kushal.
So my one, I can say where I think the Atmos can, I don't know how they'll manage it, because most installs of Atmos are basically, even in residential because spaces, because that's the end user, besides cinema, most of these systems, unlike audiophile systems, will be right up against the wall, you know,
Right.
against the front wall of the system. The main speakers will probably be architecturally mounted or right next to the wall. And the sense of depth, because see, you have a great sense of width and a great sense of envelopment. You know, you'll have height, you'll have width, you'll even have a bubble at the back. But the sense of depth, which comes out of a audiophile system, but typically a 2-channel, because of whatever phase differences reflecting from the wall or whatever, that sense of depth is something that Dolby needs to incorporate into their algorithm. Because that doesn't exist. Because, you know, when you hear classical music, I mean, in Atmos, you get a singular plane from the front instead of the layer that you would get in a concert hall. Right. I think, and I've heard another immersive processor that actually does that brilliantly. You know, I mean, it actually layers the musicians in the concert hall, you know.
Right.
So I think Dolby needs to work on that one singular aspect. You know, and if Brent has still friends over there, I think he should tell them that this is the one aspect where they really need to look at it. Not that I don't think that they care much, but if they're going to take Atmos music seriously, not movies. I mean, movies anyways, you don't need that kind of depth because you're within the action. Right. But if you want to do Atmos music, I think this could be something which could get a lot of non-audiophiles interested, you know, because it's amazing to see a non-audiophile when they first hear a high-end audio system and they see the sense of depth and say, oh, I can hear that instrument coming from way behind, you know. So this could be an opportunity for them to really get people on the bandwagon. That's what I feel.
That's a wonderful point, KJ. Thanks a lot, Kushal.
That's an interesting idea, because I never really thought about that. But look, I think in-wall speakers, if they're well implemented, which they usually are not, but if they're really well implemented, they can sound very spacious, but they're usually not. And to have, and yeah, putting your speakers a couple feet out into the room, we all know it just sounds better. So, but Dolby's not going to, I don't want to speak for Dolby, but what the hell? Dolby's not going to do that, because that would be kind of admitting that their technology has a limitation and can be improved on. I think it's unlikely they'll do it, but there's a great opportunity for a third-party company to come in. Maybe not, well, an opportunity for a third party to come in and say, hey, we figured out how to do this. You can put this code in there and it'll make your in-walls sound more like speakers out in the room. It seems to me that that's very doable. And, you know, a Denon Marantz or a Sony or a Yamaha could certainly do that on their own as well. You know, they had the sophistication to figure out how to do that. And then they'd have a competitive advantage. Whether Dolby did it, I would say, knowing at least what I remember about Dolby Politics, if they found a third-party company that did it, they might buy the third-party company and then fold that in. Well, I mean, they've done that lots of times before. So, you know, it's possible, and you know, there's a lot of engineers there, and I'm sure that I can almost guarantee you that some engineer there has thought of this, and whether or not I think my guess is that if a third-party company came out and did this and actually got it to work, Dolby would probably just buy them and make it like an extra feature, and you know, sort of just like they did with ProLogic 2. They just bought it from Jim Fosgate, and
right.
You know, they heard it and they bought it, and it was a giant success, and it worked really, really well. And you know, Dolby headphone they bought from somebody. Actually, they bought the company. They bought Lake, which is the company that came out with Dolby headphones. And they've since bought some other companies, and they've bought technologies, and they're always, you know, when I was there, I had a constant stream of people from, you know, third-party companies wanting to pitch me stuff. Even though I didn't make the decisions on that, I was kind of a high-profile person who they could figure out how to get in touch with. So that kind of thing could happen. That's a good idea. I hope somebody's listening to this, and I hope somebody starts messing around with it, because there's a lot of DSP engineers who could figure out how to do this, I think.
Actually, I've heard a immersive processor which takes 2 channels in and can go up to I think around 15 channels out, and it extrapolates 2-channel information. And believe me, it was like being in a concert hall. It had that concert hall tonality.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you're saying, as you said, Khusro, it's a question about layering the Atmos, the various layers, and doing a good job of it.
Yeah, it was incredible. So I was wondering if that guy can do it out of extrapolating around 2 channels. It would be a piece of cake for Dolby to do it in an immersive mix. You know,
I got to say that SRS, before DTS bought them, had this unbelievably great matrix decoder that was like ProLogic 2, but even way better than ProLogic 2. And actually, a friend of mine who left Dolby and started consulting for SRS called me up and said, "You got to come hear this thing." And I was in LA, and they were in Orange County, so it was like a 2-hour drive for me. It was not a big deal. I went down, and it was mind blowing. And I started walking around the room, and I'm like, I can't hear any phase effects. He says they're not there. And this guy was one of the absolute top people at Dolby when he was there. And I was like, God, this is so exciting. This is so great. This is going to be, you almost don't need digital, like, you know, discrete digital encoding. This thing is so good. And DTS bought the company and just put it on a shelf, didn't do anything with it. It's still out there.
Oh, wow.
It was so, it sounds like what you're talking about. So yeah, it's like there's a new generation of matrix decoding that I think could be done, that I've at least heard in that case, that is really promising, but I don't know how much interest there is in that in the market, and how you necessarily sell it. I mean, it was different 20 years ago when AD receivers were such a big deal, but now AD receivers are not a big deal. So it's kind of hard to I wouldn't want to write the business plan for that.
I wish Brent was there in ISC this year. And
oh, me too.
And to hear that hollow plot, that was scary. I mean, I'll just give you an idea before we shut down. I know it's taking a lot of time. So hollow plot is a technology out of Germany which has a central array of beam steered loudspeakers. It's unlike anything I've seen. And they had 4 reflectors put in that room. Just 4 large wooden reflectors. And then it's in a large hall. I mean, a kind of a banquet hall. And they said, hear this piece of recording in which there is a storm in a ship, and the captain is speaking, and you can move from front to back of the hall. That's almost 20-25 feet. And the sound pressure level of the captain speaking will not change. It will remain the same.
Wow.
The sound pressure level of the storm will not change. It will remain the same. And believe me, when the thunder cracks, it really cracks. Okay. I mean, it was so scary. And they said at the back of the hall, which is like 30 feet away from the speakers, maybe in 40 feet, there's a green line. There's a green line, which is about 7 feet long. Stand anywhere on the green line. You will hear the ship. You will hear the thunderstorm. You will hear the captain, and you will hear somebody whispering behind your head.
Wow.
And it was so eerie because that person is talking right behind your head and telling them, you're going to die. You're going to die. And the ship captain is screaming. The thunderstorm is there. The ship is doing its whole thing. The bell is ringing.
Right.
So it was at a different level of immersiveness. I mean, it was scary.
Yeah.
I mean, it was insane. Brent, you got to go and hear Holoplot. As somebody in the
I just
audio
looked it up.
industry.
I've seen this before, but I've not heard it. And it looks really, it's a really like complicated speaker array. I'm sure it costs a lot of money, but it looks like it could be incredibly capable.
Oh yes.
I really would like to hear this. I wish I had gone to ISE this year, but I don't go to that many audio shows anymore. I kind of my job is to sit and review giant piles of gear. So they're happy that my current employer is really happy to keep me sitting at home,
yeah,
unboxing things and playing them and testing them and sending them back and getting the next boxes in. And so I don't get to audio shows as much as I might have liked, but I would really like to hear that. Maybe they'll do it at the CEDIA show this year, and maybe I'll go to the CEDIA show, which is the US ISE.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's something every audio industry person needs to experience. So they had 3 boxes, left, center, right. You sit at this, and they played the array, and it's this. If you go to the left box, right box, and center box, it is the same announcement in German, Chinese, and Spanish.
Wow.
Oh wow.
Can you imagine that? And you can't hear the other ones. We stand in the left box, is in Chinese. You go to the center, it's in German, and you go to the right one, it's in some other language.
Wow.
That's the same announcement.
Wow. That's eerie.
Yeah, I think Ram must have heard it too. I mean, I'm not sure.
Ram was there at Ram sir was there at ISC, so I'm sure he was.
So I think every audio reviewer needs to see where digital is really going in that sense, in audio.
Very nice. Guys, I think it's time to wind up. We have had a very nice session. Thanks a lot, Brent. Thanks a lot, KJ.
Thank you, Brent.
Kushro.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Brent.
Any other questions can be we can handle it offline. Maybe
Thank you, Brent.
Sorry? Oh, Sandeep, are you there?
Yeah.
Sandeep, you had something to say? You had a question?
No, basically it was very educative.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Righto. So Brent, thanks a lot for your time, and let's call an end to the session. Thanks a lot for all of you all to participate in today's session. The upcoming session would be probably sometime in the next 20 days to a month or so, and we are looking at topics to discuss, and I'll get back on that very soon. Thanks a lot, and have a good night.
Thanks,
good day,
everybody.
Good day to you, Brent.
Good night.
Bye. Good day. Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, guys.